For several months in 1980, 32-year-old single mother Dorothy Jane Scott received multiple disturbing and terrifying phone calls from an unknown man, a man who alternately swore his undying love for her and vowing to brutally murder her. Then, in May of that same year, she was kidnapped and murdered. Her killer, or killers, have never been caught. This is True Crime Portal. Before we begin, we'd like to offer our condolences to the family and friends of Dorothy Jane Scott, who was so cruelly taken from them so long ago. Unknown caller. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on the 23rd of April, 1948, to Jacob and Vera Scott. Not much is publicly known about her childhood, or why she was a single mother at the time of her disappearance, but what is well known is that, by all accounts, she was a loving mother of a 4-year-old boy, and she worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. One at a shop that sold psychedelic products like lava lamps and love beads, the other at a head shop, which sold cannabis paraphernalia, and she was, again by all accounts, a devout Christian and a complete teetotaler. No drinking, no drugs, nothing. She rarely dated and had no steady boyfriend, at least not one that anyone knew about anyway. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy began receiving phone calls, both at home and at work, from an unknown man. She believed the man's voice to be familiar to her, but could not recall from where she might recognize it. During one particular call, he told Dorothy to go outside and check her car. What she found was both mystifying and horrifying. A single red rose. But unlike the roses you or I would get for those we care about, this rose was dead. The unknown caller would also alternate between proclaiming his love for her and vowing to brutally murder her, as well as providing details about her daily life that only someone who was stalking her would know. During one notable call that terrified Dorothy enough that she considered buying a handgun for protection, the man said, "When I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you." Although she opted not to get a firearm because of her young son and the possibility he might find it and hurt himself accidentally, by mid-May she had started taking karate classes for self-defense. Spider bite. On May 28, 1980, Dorothy was attending an employee meeting at work when she noticed that a fellow employee, Conrad Bostron, looked ill and had a red mark on his arm. Concerned, she and another coworker, Pam Head, volunteered to take Bostron to the University of California Irvine Medical Center emergency room. On the way to the hospital, Dorothy made a quick stop at her parents' house to check on her son, as he was often babysat there while Dorothy was working. While there, she also changed out her black scarf for a red one, which will be notable in a bit. Once they arrived at the hospital, doctors determined Bostron was suffering from the bite of a black widow spider, and he was treated. Dorothy and Pam stayed in the waiting room of the ER during his treatment. According to Pam, Dorothy never once left her side. When Bostron was discharged around 11 p.m., Dorothy volunteered to bring her car to the door to spare the man a walk through the parking lot, as he was still noticeably ill. She did make a quick restroom trip before heading out to retrieve her vehicle, and this was the only time Dorothy was out of sight while inside the hospital, Pam said. While Dorothy went to fetch the car, Pam and Bostron got his prescription filled, then went to wait near the exit doors. When Dorothy failed to appear after several minutes, they went outside to look for her. Out in the lot, they were startled to see Dorothy's car suddenly speed towards them, the headlights blinding them. Instead of stopping to pick them up, despite Pam and Bostron wildly waving their arms to get Dorothy's attention, the car sped past and made a sharp right turn out of the lot. Thinking there might be an emergency situation with Dorothy's son, the pair went back inside to await Dorothy's return. After a few hours with no sign of her, however, Bostron and Pam reported Dorothy missing. Once again, publicly available sources are somewhat lacking in detail regarding the initial search, but just a few hours later, Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon was found in an alley about 10 miles from the hospital, thoroughly engulfed in flames, with no signs of her or her supposed kidnapper. Dorothy Jane Scott was never seen alive again. Another unknown caller. Around a week after Dorothy disappeared, her mother Vera began receiving phone calls from an unknown man.
"Are you related to Dorothy Scott?"
asked an obviously disguised male voice. When Vera anxiously answered that she was, the voice said,
"I've got her,"
then immediately hung up. Dorothy's father, Jacob, was initially told by the police to refrain from speaking to the press about the case for fear of compromising the investigation. Not satisfied with the speed of that investigation, however, Jacob talked to the Santa Ana Register, the local newspaper, about a week after his daughter vanished. A few days later, the paper ran a story about Dorothy's disappearance. The same day that story appeared in the paper, Pat Riley, the Register's managing editor, received a call, again from an unknown man. "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." Now, if you'll recall, most everyone who knew Dorothy said that while she might have been on a few dates, she was not in a serious relationship. So if the unknown caller was correct, nobody knew this. The unidentified caller, who remains unknown to this day, also divulged details only the person responsible would know, information that was deliberately withheld by the police. For example, the caller knew Dorothy had switched scarves from black to red, and that Conrad Bostrom went to the hospital due to a spider bite. He also stated that Dorothy had called him from the hospital, but Pam Head was adamant that Dorothy was never out of sight until she went to the restroom just before going to retrieve her car. And remember, these were the days before cell phones were commonplace, and Dorothy never used the payphone, again, according to Pam. When the police learned of this call, it led them to believe it was genuinely from the kidnapper himself. The call to Vera, Dorothy's mother, was only the first. They continued, with the unknown voice calling almost every Wednesday for nearly 4 years. I can't imagine the torture Vera experienced every time the voice said, "I've got her," or asking, "Is Dorothy home?" before quickly hanging up. The police did tap the Scott's phone, but the caller never stayed on the line long enough for a trace to be executed. The calls themselves only ended in April of 1984 when, by chance, Jacob happened to be home and answered the phone. Dorothy's ex, the father of her son, was interviewed and investigated, but provided an ironclad alibi and was ruled out as a suspect very early in her disappearance. Dorothy's remains are found. Just over 4 years after her disappearance, on the 6th of August, 1984, a construction worker happened upon some skeletal remains, both canine and human, laying side by side just off Santa Ana Canyon Road, roughly 25 minutes away from the hospital. There wasn't much left of the human remains. A skull, a pelvis, 2 thigh bones, and an arm were all that was found. It was unclear how long the remains were there, but authorities estimated it was at least 2 years as the bones were charred, possibly by a brush fire that swept through that area in 1982. It seems more likely, however, that the remains were there since the night she disappeared, as, in addition to the remains, a turquoise ring was found in the area, as well as a watch that was reported to have stopped on May 29th at 12:30-ish a.m., roughly an hour after Dorothy's car was last seen by her co-workers Pam Head and Conrad Bostrom. The human remains were positively identified through dental records as those of Dorothy Scott on August 14th, 1984. As Dorothy didn't own a dog, it's been theorized that the canine carcass was placed there to throw off any possible cadaver dog or police searches. The scent covers up a human body for the dogs, and the physical remains will often deter the police from digging deeper to the human remains possibly buried below it. The cause and manner of her death could not be determined by an autopsy. Her memorial service took place on August 22, 1984. Another phone call came to Dorothy's parents soon after her remains were discovered, in which the disguised voice asked, "Is Dorothy home?" Accounts of this story tend to vary as to whether this was the final call or if there were others after that. Dorothy's son was raised by her parents. Sadly, both Jacob and Vera Scott passed away, Jacob in 1994, on what would have been Dorothy's 46th birthday. Vera passed in 2002. They both passed never knowing who murdered their daughter or why. What's next? This is a fascinating case, albeit quite a disturbing one as well. Dorothy Jane Scott was most likely victimized by a stalker, something that was largely unknown at the time, much less understood. There were certainly few laws, if any, against it. Given the condition of her remains when they were discovered, and with DNA barely known at the time, at least forensically, what little they could tell law enforcement seemed to be of next to no evidentiary value. So what comes next? Well, to put it bluntly, I have no idea. As far as I'm aware, there's no DNA or any other known evidence, no witnesses, there's not even any real suspects. To this day, no suspect or suspects have been named in Dorothy Scott's kidnapping and murder, although there was at least one informal suspect who I won't name because law enforcement has yet to declare them as an official suspect, for lack of a better term, or even a person of interest. It's highly doubtful that this person can or will be linked to Dorothy's murder, barring something completely unforeseen happening, as they passed away in 2014. Short of getting a deathbed confession, either from the killer or killers, or someone who knew the killer, I fear the murder of Dorothy Jane Scott may never be solved, which is heartbreaking for her surviving family. If you have any information that might help solve Dorothy Scott's kidnapping and murder, I encourage you to contact the Santa Ana, California Police Department at 714-245-8049, or you can contact Orange County Crime Stoppers anonymously at 1-855-847-6227. If you've made it this far, do us a favor and hit that like button, share the video, drop a comment or leave your theories about the Dorothy Scott murder down below, and subscribe to the channel for more true crime stories just like this. I thank you for watching, and make sure to watch over each other and stay safe out there.